Hello, wormies. What comes to mind first when I say the words an anthropologist on Mars? Alien metaphors are pretty common in the autistic community because we often feel like aliens struggling to fit in and blend into a society that constantly puzzles us, and I'm sure views us as equally enigmatic, and sometimes it's a really frustrating feeling. So when I first saw this book by Oliver Sacks, a British neurologist, I was quite intrigued and had to read it. Welcome back to my channel, where you can be your authentic, weird, and wormy self. I'm Hannah, and I have ADHD and autism. I make weekly videos on this channel rating the representation of autism, ADHD, and other neurodiverse conditions in the media. If you're interested in this kind of content, then go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button to join the neurodiverse bookworm family and never miss out on a latest recommendation. Today, we're going to be talking about the book An Anthropologist on Mars by British neurologist Oliver Sacks. Oliver Sacks was born in London and grew up during the Second World War, but he moved to the United States after his education and primarily practiced for the rest of his life in New York City. And he was fascinated by the inner workings of the brain, and I'm sure he kind of saw himself in a way as an anthropologist on Mars, because the human brain is so complex, so fascinating, that it's like a universe inside of our heads. Each one of us is a totally different ecosystem, a totally different planet. And Oliver Sacks wrote a number of books and other publications in magazines detailing the accounts of some of his most interesting patients. In fact, the New York Times called him a kind of medical poet laureate. One thing to keep in mind when you're reading this book is that Oliver Sacks was a product of his time, and there will be terms used in this book such as defective, retarded, or other words that have kind of a bad connotation today. But I don't feel that he was using them in a bad sense. He was using them in their medical sense, and over time these words have changed. So keep that in mind if you decide to pick up this book. I didn't find that it detracted from its overall enjoyability or made it offensive in any way. I'm going to be focusing on the last couple of chapters because those are the ones that deal with autism. But in this book, it covers a case of a painter who became colorblind after an accident. In another chapter, he talks about a man who became stuck in the hippie era as a result of a brain tumor. A surgeon with Tourette's. Now, would you trust a surgeon with Tourette's? You tell me down in the comments. I think I would be kind of skeptical, but who knows? And he also talks about a man who was born blind, not necessarily born blind, but that he had a condition that limited his ability to see, which was later reversed in middle age, but yet his brain was unable to process the images properly despite his ability to see physically. And there was also a man stuck in a dreamlike state, able to paint phenomenal pictures of his boyhood town that he hadn't been to in more than 40 years. But let's talk about the last two chapters, Prodigies, and the one that gave its name to the book, An Anthropologist on Mars. The chapter Prodigies focuses on an interesting question. What is the relationship between super savant skills and really low abilities in other areas? For instance, he writes, almost all savants have prodigious powers of memory. Dr. J. Langdon Down, one of the greatest observers in this realm, who coined the term idiot savant in 1887, remarked that extraordinary memory was often associated with very great defect of reasoning power. And savant skills are not just in reading, they're in music, they're in mathematical human calculators, languages, even to physical feats of ability. Yet the rates of savant skills are higher, considerably higher in the population with other intellectual disabilities than they are in the normal human population. So what do you think? Why is there something like that? Let me know down in the comments what your theories are for this. And so Oliver Sacks explores in this chapter, especially through recounting the story of Stephen Wiltshire, that he met and studied in person, whether these savant skills were, I guess you could say, heightened by the other intellectual disabilities, and if there is any relationship, what is it? Oliver Sacks also asks if there's any relationship between having autism or savant skills and one's perception and an ability to put it into art. He asks, the tests that had been given to him, that's Stephen Wiltshire, seemed to confirm the severity of his emotional and intellectual defect. Was there, nonetheless, a mental and personal dimension, a depth and sensibility in him that could emerge, if nowhere else, in his art? Was not art quintessentially an expression of a personal vision, a self? Could one be an artist without having a self? All these questions had been in my mind since I had first seen Stephen's pictures, and I was eager to meet him. And in this chapter, the artist paints a picture of Stephen Wiltshire, who was very famous for painting a very detailed picture of the New York City skyline after flying over it in a helicopter. And the author wanted to understand how he could do this, and the stereotypes were, and still to some extent, that autistics are unfeeling, that there's almost no emotional human depth to them. And the author worried about reducing Stephen to a mere bunch of numbers and test results rather than seeing him as a whole human being. And he talks about traveling with Stephen and observing him in many different sectors, trying to understand these things. And he says afterwards, after all this testing, I was still bewildered. Stephen seemed so defective and so gifted simultaneously. Were his defects and his gifts totally separate, or were they at a deeper level integrally related? Were there qualities like autistic literalness and concreteness that might, in some contexts, be gifts, in others, deficits? The tests also gave me a feeling of disquiet, as if I had spent days reducing Stephen to defects and gifts and not seeing him as a human being, a whole. And that's one thing I really liked about this book. Oliver Sacks shows a great curiosity and a desire to get to know his patients, to listen to them, to understand them for who they are, and he shows his own learning journey along with that of his patients. Unfortunately, as was common in his time, Sacks had difficulty understanding that autism is inseparable from our real self and is nothing to be rescued from, that we can, and people with intellectual disabilities can understand some complex things, have feelings, and express them, even though it might be different from people's traditional understanding. The chapter on prodigies ends with, Stephen's drawings may never develop, may never add up to a major opus, an expression of a deep feeling or theory or view of the world, and he may never develop or enter the full estate, the grandeur and misery of being human, of man. But this is not to diminish him or to call his gifts small. His limitations, paradoxically, can serve as strengths too. His vision is valuable, it seems to me, precisely because it conveys a wonderfully direct, unconceptualized view of the world. Stephen may be limited, odd, idiosyncratic, autistic, but it is given to him to achieve what few of us do, a significant representation and investigation of the world. So here he wrestles with the two ideas, understanding that we have a depth of feeling and expression, and also the stereotypical idea of the day that we are kind of empty, cold, shut off, and unable to experience the fullest pleasures of being human. I would argue, in some cases, we experience them more, but we experience them and express them in different ways. What would you say are your strengths, your gifts, and weaknesses? They don't have to be savant skills, but I'm sure you have something you're good at. And how does your autism, ADHD, or brain affect the way you see the world? Let me know down in the comments. In the chapter that gives the book its name, Oliver Sacks talks about his brief visit with and study of Temple Grandin, one of the first well-known, successful autistic women who has written a bunch of papers both on animal husbandry and autism. I will definitely be reviewing some of her books in the future. And she was also an incredible inventor, visual thinker, and I would love one day to meet her and get to know her too. Sacks quotes Temple Grandin as saying she felt like an anthropologist on Mars, observing humans minutely, trying to be able to fit in, trying to understand how they work, but never ever feeling quite human. And it really is a strange feeling. I remember before being diagnosed that I had this feeling of wearing other people's faces, like putting on a mask and asking how they would act or look, or what expression would they wear on their face, how would they see the world, instead of looking at it through my own eyes. In these chapters, he compares similar cases to his main case. One thing that I found interesting was his visit to a family that the mother, the father, and the children were autistic, and how they had adapted their house to meet their needs. I've always wondered, what would it be like to live in a house that was designed by and for neurodivergent individuals. I want to quote him saying, "When I first arrived at their house, the whole atmosphere was so normal that I wondered if I had been misinformed, or if I had not, perhaps ended up at the wrong house. for there was nothing obviously autistic about them or it. It was only after I had settled down that I noticed the well-used trampoline where the whole family at times likes to jump and flap their arms, the huge library of science fiction, the strange cartoons pinned to the bathroom wall, and the ludicrously explicit directions pinned up in the kitchen for cooking, laying the table, and washing up, suggesting that these had to be performed in a fixed, formulaic way. This, I learned later, was an autistic in-joke. Mrs. B spoke of herself at one point as bordering on normality, but then made clear that such bordering meant, we know the rules and conventions of the normal, but there's no actual transit. You act normal, you learn the rules and obey them. And for sure, I'm good at pretending to be a normal human being, even though I do wonder what would I be like, if I were able to fully unmask and understand who I am without that mask, and what is it like living a life that's fully attuned to my needs. I've already made some changes in that after my diagnosis and no longer try to measure my lifestyle, habits, clothes, whatever, based on neurotypical standards, because I am not. How would you rearrange your life to be the ideal life that meets your needs and gives you the optimum comfort at home? One thing I really related to in his account and quotes of Temple Grandin is that she liked to commit small acts of mischievous defiance, such as walking slightly outside the line of walkways in airports, or just minor things to go against the system, and how she distinguished that from the real badness that could result in horrible, even lethal consequences. I don't know what it is, but I also kind of get a kick out of doing such things. I remember as a kid thinking it was the funniest thing to smuggle some onions or some fruit hidden in the cars. We would drive across the border to Canada to visit my grandparents, and I never really even told anybody, but somehow I felt like I was chuckling internally, and I still do stuff like that. It's not for anybody else's amusement, but there's a private internal joke that I don't even know how to explain about this kind of stuff. And finally, he and Temple both are worried that genetic testing and research could lead to potential eradication of autism. And if you eradicate autism and its traits, which in the right environments, given the right supports, can be highly beneficial, then you might eradicate future inventors and people that could truly benefit society. I'm going to rate an Anthropologist on Mars by Oliver Sacks an overall score of 3. Not because I disliked reading it, I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, but because some of the terminology is outdated and there's some inaccuracies, but much of the information is still valid, and it's certainly fascinating to see the author's curiosity, care, and growth in his understanding of his patients. For accuracy and relatability, I give this book a 2, I would say. Diversity, definitely 5, because he relates many different genders, nationalities, different jobs. I find this book quite diverse. Accuracy, it also receives a 2. As I mentioned, there's quite a bit of outdated information and terminology. But still, don't let that keep you from reading the accounts and analyses of his patients. It's certainly a thought-provoking book because it challenges you to see beyond the surface of people, to get to know them, to listen to them, to challenge stereotypes, and to grow as a person, to pose questions to yourself and ask yourself if your assumptions might not be incorrect. And that is one thing I really loved about Oliver Sacks, and wish I could have met him, because he was a man that demonstrated growth and care and curiosity. He wasn't just a product of the ideas of his time. He knew how to challenge them. I rate this book a 2 on the scale of accessibility, because while it is interesting to read, it's not laid out particularly in a way that would be easy for someone with dyslexia or another reading difficulty to read. It's quite densely packed. It's got a high vocabulary level, and even I learned some new words from it. So again, the overall score is 3, but I highly recommend that you read this book, and I will be buying and reading other books by him, such as The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. I love Oliver Sacks's enthusiasm, detail in relating his cases, as well as his obvious concern, care, and respect for his patients that inspire me to get to know people for who they are and challenge my own stereotypes and conceptions. Thanks so much for watching. If you're interested in more neurodiversity content, then click here to see my latest review. And of course, hit that like button, comment what you would like me to review next, and subscribe so that you don't miss a latest recommendation. See you next week.